Welcome to this series on shorebird plumage and molt. Although much of the content applies globally, the particular context I have in mind is of shorebirds in Malaysia. This series and some of the graphics used in it can be found at the website shorebirds.my. And in part 1, in this particular video, I shall be defining some terms used to describe plumage and molt. Learning outcomes for this series, I hope that you'll be able to better understand the terms used to describe plumage, molt, and age of shorebirds, and as a result, you'll be able to better understand what you're looking at in the field when you observe shorebirds. I'm not a ringer or a bander, although I have done a little bit of that. So my focus will be on observing birds in the field rather than in the hand. Shorebird plumage and molt are closely related. Simply put, a molt results in a plumage, and plumage appearance tells us something about the age of the bird. And in this video, as I define the terms that we'll be using, I'll be relying heavily on this book, Molt in North American Birds by Steve N.G. Howell, which in my opinion is the best and most comprehensive book on the subject of molt. Any mistakes are mine, however. So first of all, a plumage is a generation of feathers attained by a molt. A molt is the regular, ordered growth of feathers by which a new generation of feathers or plumage is attained. So, in other words, molt is both regular and ordered. It is not simply a haphazard dropping and regrowing of individual feathers, but it happens according to a prescribed schedule and order. Aging, which we won't talk about in this video, but we will in subsequent videos, is not something that is inherent in the bird. It's a deductive process that we use as birders based upon what we can see of the bird's plumage and molt. If you've ever tried to learn about molt before, you may have been confused by the huge number of terms used to label plumages. And the reason for this is that there are several different systems for doing so. Some systems refer to seasons, such as first winter, adult summer, and so on. These were terms thought up in the northern hemisphere, and so they can be confusing to birders in the southern hemisphere where the seasons are opposite, or in equatorial regions where we don't really have clear-cut seasons. Other systems refer to events in a bird's life or the appearance of the feathers, for example, breeding plumage, male plumage, and so on. And while these can be helpful in the field, they can also be confusing when talking about shorebirds that don't migrate, don't have clearly defined breeding seasons, or don't change in appearance throughout the year. A couple of examples would be Malaysian plover and red-wattled lapwing, which is shown here. So I'll be using a system which does not link plumage and molt to seasons, appearance, or life events. It's known as the modified Humphrey-Park system, in case you're interested. All adult shorebirds molt on a repeated cyclical schedule, which is called the basic plumage cycle. And this usually corresponds to a year or 12 months. There are 2 main molts per cycle, and there are also 2 consequent plumages. Having said that I will not be using terms related to seasons, with migratory species which breed in the northern hemisphere, The timing of their molts is quite tightly controlled by their need to molt at a time when they're not breeding or migrating, due to the fact that these life events require expenditure of additional energy. And since the breeding and migration of these species are determined by the seasons, their molts are too, and they can be roughly mapped onto a calendar. So I'm showing you a 12-month calendar here. The factors influencing timing of breeding for resident species are not as well understood and may not be consistent in relation to the monthly calendar. So their sequence of molt and plumage, even though it's the same as in migratory species, the timing of it may be different. So in this diagram, or these diagrams, I shall be referring to migratory species. So first of all, we start the cycle with pre-basic molt. And this then leads to basic plumage. After that, another molt, pre-alternate molt, and that leads to alternate plumage. All species have at least one complete molt where they exchange all their feathers for new ones in a cycle, and that is called the pre-basic molt. So the resulting plumage is called basic plumage. It's always complete, and for migratory shorebirds, pre-basic molt occurs after breeding, either before or after the southward migration, as you can see in the little diagram on the top right here, somewhere between July and September roughly. The second plumage during the basic plumage cycle is called alternate plumage, and this is acquired through pre-alternate molt. And for migratory species, this occurs before breeding, and it starts before northward migration, and it is usually a partial molt in which the flight feathers, the primaries, secondaries, and tail feathers are not molted. So it's a partial molt. I use a little rhyme which helps me remember which molts occur when. Some in spring, all in autumn. So that helps me to remember that pre-alternate molt is partial and basic molt, pre-basic molt is complete. But I realize this runs into this problem of seasons again. So if this doesn't work for you, you'll have to come up with something that does. Maybe complete after nesting is complete, partial before picking a mate. I'm sure you can do better. Young birds in their first year of life, so-called first-year birds, follow a different pattern of molt in order to get up to speed with the adult cycle, which happens when they're about a year old. And this is known as the first plumage cycle. They have 3 molts and 3 plumages in their first plumage cycle. Their first set of feathers is known as juvenile plumage, and this replaces the down that they are covered with at hatching, and of course is attained by a complete molt. Then sometime after that, they undergo preformative molt, which is usually a partial molt, not including the flight and tail feathers, and that results in formative plumage. This is a one-off plumage which occurs only in the first cycle of the bird's life. After that, they undergo pre-alternate molt to attain alternate plumage, usually at the beginning of their second calendar year, so that means from January onwards. And then at the beginning of their second cycle, when they're roughly a year old, they begin the adult molt cycle with pre-basic molt into basic plumage. And from there on, they follow the basic plumage cycle, which simply repeats year on year. So, looking again at the first plumage cycle, juvenile plumage is the first set of feathers. It replaces the fluffy down of the hatchlings. It's always a complete molt, and in migratory species in Malaysia at least, we usually only see juveniles or birds in juvenile plumage between roughly the months of August and October. After that, the next molt is preformative molt, which results in formative plumage. It's a partial molt in most species at least. There are one or two exceptions which in subsequent videos I will point out. Preformative molt replaces body plumage, including some wing coverts and tertials, but not flight feathers or tail feathers. And then the next plumage is alternate plumage. Sometimes we call it first alternate plumage to differentiate it from the definitive or the adult alternate plumage. This is also a partial molt. And again, that means it replaces body plumage, some coverts and tertials, but not flight feathers and not the tail. The next molt sees the bird moving from its first plumage cycle into the adult or basic plumage cycle. This happens when the bird is roughly a year old and it undergoes a complete pre-basic molt into basic plumage. And thereafter, it will follow the basic plumage cycle for the rest of its life. So, a lot of terms, a lot of labels, and I realize this is probably a bit of fire hose treatment, but hopefully by watching this, if needed, if necessary, a second or third time, you'll be able to get the labels or the names of these different plumages and molts fixed in your mind. So, just to recap, the first plumage cycle, which I've colored orange for some reason, consists of juvenile plumage, followed by preformative molt, followed by formative plumage, and then pre-alternate molt, followed by alternate plumage, which in the first year we sometimes call first alternate plumage. Then, around a year of age, the bird transitions into the basic plumage cycle, which begins with pre-basic molt, which results in basic plumage, and then pre-alternate molt, which results in alternate plumage, and that basic plumage cycle will then continue for the rest of the bird's life. So that's it for this video. In the following videos, we will look in more detail at each of the molts and plumages and give examples of what they look like in different species.